Hey guys, tonight we walk barefoot across cold marble floors as torchlight flickers against red-painted walls, and you can almost smell the iron in the air before you see it. You are standing in Rome. Not the postcard Rome of gelato and selfies, but the Rome that has just won a war. Somewhere beyond the hills, a defeated army is dissolving back into farms and forests. And here in the city, the spoils are being counted. Gold, weapons, captives, and names that once made soldiers tremble. One of those names belongs to a queen. And if you're imagining a dignified retirement plan involving vineyards and respectful silence, you probably won't survive this. Rome has a habit of turning powerful people into lessons. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are living in a world where Rome believes victory must be visible. It's not enough to win a battle or sign a treaty. Power has to be displayed, paraded, and pressed into the collective memory like a seal into warm wax. This is where punishment begins, not as rage, but as choreography. Rome thinks in symbols, and a captured queen is the most potent symbol of all. She represents a land that dared to resist, an authority that claimed to rival Rome's own, and a reminder that even divinely favored rulers can be unmade. One mainstream historical fact sets the tone here. Roman triumphs are not optional celebrations. They are state-sanctioned rituals, approved by the Senate, and designed to show the gods, the people, and Rome's enemies that order has been restored. Generals wait years for the honor of a triumph, and when it's granted, every detail matters. The route, the costumes, the prisoners, all are selected to tell a story. And you, drifting quietly through this scene, realize that punishment is not merely about pain, it's about narrative control. Captured queens fit into this narrative in an awkward, dangerous way. Rome is deeply uncomfortable with the idea of female sovereignty, especially foreign female sovereignty. A woman who ruled armies and commanded loyalty disrupts Roman assumptions about gender and power. So Rome responds by reframing her. She is no longer a ruler, she is a trophy. You can almost hear the mental gymnastics creaking. If Rome can reduce her from queen to captive, then Rome's worldview remains intact. There is a quirky tidbit that often surprises people drifting off to sleep with Roman history humming in their ears. Romans sometimes cataloged captives with the same bureaucratic care they used for livestock. Names, ages, origins, everything written down. Somewhere, a tired clerk might be scratching notes about a defeated queen while wondering what he's having for dinner. It's oddly mundane, and that mundanity is part of the horror. Punishment doesn't always wear a villain's face. Sometimes it wears a bored one. As you stand here, you notice how early the punishment begins. It starts the moment capture becomes inevitable. A queen who once negotiated treaties now negotiates survival. Guards watch her closely, not because she's physically dangerous, but because she's symbolically volatile. If she escapes, Rome looks weak. If she dies too soon, Rome loses a prop. So she is kept alive, fed enough, and guarded carefully. Power, in this moment, is not loud, it is patient. Historians still argue whether Roman leaders fully understood the psychological impact of parading defeated queens, or whether they simply followed tradition without reflection. Some suggest the spectacle was meant primarily for Roman citizens, reinforcing loyalty and awe. Others think it was a calculated message to subject peoples. Resist, and this is how your leaders end. As you listen to the echoes of sandals on stone, both explanations feel true. Rome is very good at doing the same thing for multiple reasons. You begin to sense that punishment in Rome is rarely spontaneous. There is no sudden outburst of revenge, no dramatic execution on the battlefield, at least not for someone this valuable. Instead, there is delay. Time stretches. Weeks, months, Sometimes years pass between capture and public display. This waiting is part of the punishment. The queen is suspended between identities, no longer ruling, not yet finished. If anxiety had a sound, it would be the soft clink of chains in a quiet room at night. Here comes one of those gentle reality check jokes to keep you company. If you ever fantasized about being a powerful ancient monarch, just remember that your retirement plan probably involved a rope, a parade, and zero HR protection. Joke number 1, softly delivered, because even humor needs to whisper here. Rome's idea of justice blends religion, politics, and theater. Punishment satisfies the gods, reassures the public, and flatters the elite. When the victim is a queen, all 3 layers intensify. The gods must see Rome's dominance. The people must feel safe. The Senate must feel validated. And the queen, stripped of context and allies, becomes a canvas onto which Rome paints its righteousness. There's another mainstream fact worth tucking under your pillow tonight. Roman writers like Livy and later historians often describe defeated enemies in moral terms. Queens are portrayed as arrogant, exotic, or dangerously charismatic. This literary framing justifies whatever comes next. If she was proud, then humiliation seems appropriate. If she was cunning, then restraint appears merciful. You start to notice how storytelling itself becomes a form of punishment, reshaping memory long after the chains are gone. A second light joke drifts by. Imagine being judged for eternity by historians who never met you, armed only with rumors and a strong opinion about foreign hairstyles. Not ideal, honestly. As the night deepens, you realize that Rome's punishment of captured queens is less about cruelty for cruelty's sake, and more about maintaining an illusion of inevitability. Rome wants everyone, including you, to believe that resistance always ends the same way. That belief is more powerful than any legion. The queen must be seen to fall so that no one else tries to rise. Yet there's tension here. Rome prides itself on civilization. Excessive brutality risks looking barbaric, which is awkward when you're claiming to be the civilized one. This is why punishment is so carefully staged. It must hurt, but with decorum. It must degrade, but with justification. You can almost hear a Roman senator muttering about optics centuries before the word exists. Historians still argue whether some punishments were exaggerated by later writers to heighten drama. The sources are not neutral, and memory is selective. As you lie back and let this scene settle, you understand that what survives is not the queen's voice, but Rome's version of it. Your final soft joke for this section floats in like a lullaby. Rome may have built roads that last millennia, but its conflict resolution skills were very much make it everyone's problem. You remain there in the half-light, watching the machinery of power warm up. This is only the beginning. The chains are forged, the route is planned, and the story Rome wants to tell is taking shape. For now, you breathe slowly, letting the marble cool beneath your feet, knowing that punishment in Rome is never rushed, it's rehearsed. You move with the army now, not at the head where banners snap and officers shout, but in the quieter space behind victory, where logistics replace glory. This is where captured royalty is handled, and it feels less like a dungeon and more like an inventory room. Rome is very good at moving things: grain, soldiers, marble columns, and people who used to command armies. You watch as a defeated queen is identified, separated from her remaining entourage, and quietly folded into the machinery of conquest. No one kneels, no one announces her titles. Those are considered expired. One mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Roman armies routinely took high-status captives alive, especially leaders, because they were politically useful. Killing a queen on the battlefield wastes potential leverage. Alive, she can legitimize Rome's victory. Alive, she can be shown, questioned, bargained over, and eventually displayed. So you see guards assigned not for honor, but for containment. Their job is not to hurt her. Their job is to make sure she arrives. The process of identification is almost comically procedural. Translators are summoned, local allies are questioned. Someone asks, very seriously, "Is this the ruler?" as if power might be mislabeled like a crate of olives. Once confirmed, the queen is marked, not physically yet, but administratively. From this point on, she is not a person in Rome's eyes. She is a category, royal captive. Here's a quirky tidbit that tends to surprise people drifting towards sleep. Some captured elites were allowed to keep elements of their attire during transport, not out of kindness, but because Rome wanted them recognizable later. A queen arriving in Rome dressed like an ordinary prisoner would lose symbolic value. So you might see fine fabric allowed, jewelry removed, and hair left untouched. It's branding, ancient style. The irony is almost soothing in its absurdity. You notice how travel itself becomes punishment. The queen is marched, carted, or shipped across distances she once controlled. Roads built by Rome carry her toward Rome, which feels intentional in a way that makes you slightly uncomfortable. Each milestone whispers the same message: this infrastructure belongs to us. Even your feet seem to feel it as you walk alongside, counting the steady rhythm of boots and hooves. Historians still argue whether Roman captors treated queens better than male rulers during transport. Some accounts suggest women were less likely to be physically abused. Others hint that isolation and uncertainty were the preferred tools. What's clear is that comfort is irrelevant. Predictability is the real luxury, and it's deliberately withheld. You sense that language is another weapon here. Guards speak Latin on purpose, even when they know the queen doesn't understand. Decisions are discussed around her, not with her. It's a subtle erasure. She is present, but not included. Power drains away not in a single dramatic moment, but in dozens of small exclusions. If silence had weight, it would press down gently but relentlessly. First light joke drifting by. Imagine losing your kingdom and also being forced to listen to travel plans you're not allowed to comment on. It's like the worst group chat, but with spears. When the army pauses, the queen pauses. When it eats, she eats later. When it celebrates, she is hidden. This is intentional pacing. Rome wants her arrival in the city to feel like the end of a long road, not a sudden event. Anticipation builds not just for the crowd, but for her. By the time she reaches Rome, exhaustion has done half the work punishment needs to do. There's a practical side to all this that feels oddly modern. Medical care, minimal but real, is sometimes provided. A dead queen cannot walk in a triumph. A sick queen delays schedules. So you might see a physician check her pulse, not with concern, but with calculation. Health becomes a logistical checkbox. Rome is ruthless, but it hates inefficiency more than cruelty. Another mainstream fact settles in here. Roman commanders were personally responsible for their captives until they handed them over to the state. This creates a strange incentive to keep queens alive and intact. Damage reflects poorly on the general. You can almost hear an officer reminding a soldier, "Careful, that one's for the parade." It's unsettling how casually that line fits. Second gentle joke for the road. Nothing says civilization like worrying about resale value when the currency is human dignity. As days blur together, you notice how memory starts to fray. The queen's former life becomes harder to recall. Titles feel distant. Authority fades without reinforcement. This psychological thinning is part of the design. Rome understands that a person who doubts who they were is easier to reshape into what Rome needs them to be. Historians still argue whether queens were allowed to communicate with their people during this phase. Some suggest messages were permitted to encourage surrender elsewhere. Others believe isolation was strict, preventing martyr narratives. Standing here, watching the careful balance between silence and usefulness, you suspect the answer changed depending on Rome's mood and needs. There's also the matter of appearance. Grooming becomes regulated, clean but not adorned, presentable but subdued. It's the visual language of submission. Rome doesn't want a feral captive or a radiant monarch. It wants something in between.
a living contradiction. Someone who was powerful, now visibly not.
Your third light joke arrives softly. Ancient Rome invented many things, but casual wear for defeated royalty might be the most niche fashion category in history. As the road finally bends toward the city, you feel the atmosphere shift. Guards tighten formations, conversations lower. The Queen senses it too. Rome is close now, the place where symbols matter more than facts, where her body will speak louder than any words she could say. You slow your steps, letting the dust settle, understanding that capture is not a single event, it's a process. Identification, separation, transport, each phase carefully tuned to remove layers of self. By the time the city gates appear, punishment has already done its quiet work. You breathe evenly, staying present in this moment, knowing that what comes next will be louder, brighter, and far more public. For now, the road hums beneath you, steady and unavoidable. You are inside the city now, where stone replaces dust, and the air smells faintly of smoke, oil, and too many people living too close together. This is where Rome begins the work it enjoys most, rearranging meaning. The Queen has arrived, but Rome is not ready to show her yet. First comes preparation, and preparation, in this case, means humiliation that is slow, deliberate, and oddly polite. No one shouts, no one rushes. The process feels ceremonial, like setting a table for a meal no one intends to enjoy. One mainstream historical fact grounds you here. Roman punishment for high-status captives often emphasized degradation of rank rather than physical harm. For queens, this meant dismantling the visual language of power piece by piece. You watch attendants remove symbols that once commanded obedience: crowns, signet rings, ceremonial weapons. Each object is cataloged, not smashed. Rome prefers subtraction to destruction. Power, once stripped, can be repurposed later as decoration. You notice how carefully the body itself is managed. Clothing is changed, not torn. The fabrics chosen are plain but clean, free of royal colors that might trigger recognition. Purple, famously restricted in Rome, disappears first. It's not cruelty in the theatrical sense, it's editorial work. Rome is editing the Queen's image until it fits the story it wants to tell. She is still recognizable, but diminished, like a statue with its inscription erased. Here's a quirky tidbit that lingers in your mind. Roman elites believed clothing carried moral weight. What you wore signaled who you were and where you belonged. So stripping royal garments was not just practical, it was ethical in Roman thinking. Change the clothes, change the person. Somewhere, a philosopher would nod solemnly at this logic while adjusting his own toga. The humiliation continues in posture and movement. The Queen is instructed where to stand, when to sit, when to walk. Commands are short and impersonal. No titles are used. Even her name may be avoided. This isn't forgetfulness. It's training the room to see her differently. If everyone treats her as ordinary long enough, the illusion starts to feel real. Historians still argue whether Roman officials consciously designed these moments to break a captive spirit, or whether they believed such treatment was simply appropriate for someone who had lost. The sources are frustratingly calm about it, describing humiliation as if it were a neutral administrative step. As you drift along the walls, you realize how often systems hide behind routine. The city itself participates. You pass courtyards where curious eyes linger, where whispers ripple and retreat. News travels fast in Rome, but details are controlled. People know a queen has been captured, but not yet how she will appear. Suspense builds, and suspense is part of the punishment. Being unseen but talked about creates its own quiet pressure. First light joke, easing in gently. Imagine being the most discussed person in town while also being banned from speaking. Ancient Rome invents the awkward silence before social media. You notice mirrors, or rather the lack of them. The queen rarely sees her own reflection now. Identity without reinforcement becomes slippery. Rome doesn't need to shout dominance when it can simply remove anchors. Meals are simple, eaten alone or under watch, no ceremony. Hunger is not the point, isolation is. Another mainstream fact slides into place. Roman triumphs required captives to be alive and coherent enough to walk publicly. This means humiliation stops just short of collapse. There's a careful calibration here, like turning a dial. Too much degradation risks sympathy. Too little risks defiance. Rome aims for discomfort without martyrdom. There's a second quirky detail that feels almost surreal. Some accounts suggest captives were coached, subtly or directly, on how to behave during public appearances, when to lower eyes, when to keep moving. It's stage direction masquerading as discipline. The queen is being taught a role she never auditioned for. Second gentle joke, barely above a whisper. Welcome to Rome, where even your humiliation comes with rehearsal notes. As days pass, you sense a strange stillness settling over her. Resistance becomes internal. There's nothing to push against anymore. The walls don't argue. The guards don't react. This emotional vacuum is intentional. Rome understands that outrage burns out quickly without oxygen. Historians still argue whether some queens attempted subtle defiance during this phase. Small refusals, altered posture, deliberate silence. The records are thin, filtered through Roman pens that had little interest in preserving dignity. Standing here, you suspect defiance existed, but Rome simply chose not to notice. Ignoring resistance can be more effective than crushing it. The humiliation also serves another audience, Rome itself. Senators, officials, and their families may glimpse the captive in controlled settings. These private viewings reinforce hierarchy. If a queen can be reduced to this, then everyone else should know their place. Power flows downward, and humiliation marks the boundary. Your third light joke drifts in, soft as a yawn. Rome may not have invented customer service, but it definitely mastered "you're important," just not anymore. You start to understand that humiliation here is not loud or chaotic. It is tidy, clean, almost bureaucratic. That makes it more unsettling. There is no single moment you can point to and say, this is where she broke. Instead, there are hundreds of small adjustments, each barely noticeable, each irreversible. As the day fades, lamps are lit, and the city hums with anticipation. The queen is almost ready. Not ready to be free, of course, ready to be seen. You slow your breathing, letting the quiet weight of this preparation settle around you. The stripping of status is nearly complete, and Rome is preparing to show the world what remains. You step out into the brightness of the day, where sound hits you first. Crowds murmuring, vendors calling, sandals scraping stone. This is the morning Rome has been waiting for. The triumph procession is about to begin, and everything you've witnessed so far suddenly makes sense. All that careful preparation, all that quiet subtraction of status was leading here. Today, punishment becomes public. Today, the city itself watches. One mainstream historical fact anchors the scene. Roman triumphs are elaborate victory parades that wind through the city, ending at the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. They are rare, prestigious, and deeply symbolic. Prisoners are marched ahead of the victorious general, not as an afterthought, but as a feature. You feel the tension ripple outward as the gates open and the procession begins to move. The order is deliberate. Each captive tells a story, and when the queen appears, that story reaches its climax. You walk alongside, close enough to hear chains softly brushing against fabric. They are not heavy shackles meant to torture. They are visible restraints, designed to be seen from a distance. Rome understands optics. The queen's pace is controlled, steady, neither rushed nor allowed to lag. She must appear composed enough to be dignified, yet restrained enough to be conquered. It's a narrow line, and Rome walks it carefully.
Here's a quirky tidbit that tends to drift pleasantly through the mind. Roman crowds were surprisingly attentive to fashion, even in triumphs. People commented on hairstyles, posture, and clothing. A queen's appearance would be dissected in whispers. Was she defiant, broken, proud, resigned? In a city without newspapers, the procession itself was the headline. You notice how the crowd reacts. There is cheering, yes, but also curiosity, even a touch of unease. Queens are not common sights in Rome, especially not walking in chains. Children are lifted onto shoulders. Older citizens lean on canes, squinting. Everyone wants to see how a ruler looks when she is no longer ruling. Rome is teaching by example. Historians still argue whether triumphs were meant to humiliate captives directly or to glorify Rome indirectly. Watching the faces around you, you realize it's both. The queen is not jeered constantly. In fact, there are moments of quiet as she passes. Silence, in this context, is just as powerful as mockery. It forces attention. First light joke, drifting through the noise. Imagine training your whole life to command armies, only to become the most photographed person in a parade you didn't RSVP to. The route itself is a lesson. You pass temples, forums, and monuments that celebrate Roman victories of the past. Each landmark reinforces the message. Others have fallen before you, and Rome is still here. The queen's former lands are invisible now, reduced to a name announced briefly, then replaced by cheers for the general.
Another mainstream fact settles in. Some captives were displayed with placards describing their crimes or origins. For queens, this often meant their titles were listed in the past tense, queen of, not queen a of. Grammar becomes a weapon. You feel a strange chill at how effectively language seals fate. There's another quirky detail worth lingering on. Musicians play throughout the procession, but their rhythms are controlled. No frantic beats, no mournful dirges. The sound is steady, almost soothing, keeping the crowd calm and the captives moving. It's hard to panic when the music tells you everything is under control.
Second gentle joke slides in. Nothing says we've won like background music that politely prevents chaos. You glance at the general riding behind, painted face bright, robes heavy with embroidery. He avoids looking directly at the queen. This is intentional. Acknowledging her too much would grant her significance. She is part of the display, not a participant. Rome's power flows forward, never sideways.
Historians still argue whether some queens attempted to speak during triumphs, perhaps to address the crowd or invoke their gods. Roman sources rarely mention it, which suggests either it didn't happen or it was ignored. Standing here, you suspect voices were swallowed by noise and design. Triumphs are not built for dialogue. The crowd's mood shifts subtly as the procession continues. Early excitement gives way to familiarity. People start talking among themselves again. The queen becomes another element in the moving spectacle. This too is punishment, to be reduced from singular to ordinary, even temporarily, in the eyes of thousands. Your third light joke drifts by, almost lost in the crowd. Ancient Rome perfected the art of making history feel like a parade float, impressive, moving, and slightly impersonal. As the procession nears its end, the energy tightens again. Everyone knows something final is approaching. For some captives, this would mean execution. For queens, outcomes varied, and uncertainty hangs in the air like dust. You sense the queen's awareness sharpen. This walk is not just display, it's a threshold. You slow your steps, letting the noise blur into a low hum. The triumph has done its work. Rome has shown what it wanted to show. Victory has been made visible, unforgettable. And the queen, once the center of her own world, has been folded into Rome's story. As the procession turns towards its final destination, you breathe evenly, aware that the loudest moment is ending, and quieter, more ambiguous punishments lie ahead.
The noise fades now, not all at once, but in layers. You feel it as the procession dissolves, the way excitement drains from a crowd once the main attraction passes. This is the space Cleopatra occupies in Roman memory, even though her body never walked these streets in chains. She is everywhere in the story and nowhere in the parade. Rome learns something important from her. A living queen can be more dangerous than a dead one, but a dead queen can still haunt you. One mainstream historical fact settles gently into place. Cleopatra VII of Egypt was never paraded in a Roman triumph because she died before Octavian could capture her alive. Roman sources insist on suicide, likely by poison, possibly involving an asp, though the details remain debated. What matters to Rome is not how she died, but that she denied them the spectacle. You sense the irritation beneath the official relief. Rome won the war, but lost the performance. You walk through quiet corridors where senators once debated what to do with her had she lived. Cleopatra was not just a queen, she was a political partner to Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Parading her would have been a triumph, but also a reminder of Rome's own entanglements. A chained Cleopatra might have reflected poorly on the men who once stood beside her. In death, she became easier to control. Here's a quirky tidbit that often floats unnoticed. Octavian reportedly allowed Cleopatra's children to live and be raised in Rome. It's a strange mercy that feels calculated. By absorbing her legacy into Roman households, Rome symbolically neutralized her power. The queen herself vanished, but her bloodline was quietly folded into the system that defeated her. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra chose death primarily to avoid humiliation or to preserve her image as a divine ruler. Some suggest she understood Roman triumphs well enough to know what awaited her. Others think her decision was more immediate, driven by fear and pride in equal measure. Standing here, you realize that both interpretations can coexist. Avoiding the parade may have been the last act of control available to her. First light joke, barely lifting the mood. If Rome wanted a starring attraction, Cleopatra canceled the show entirely. You notice how Roman writers respond to this absence. They fill the gap with imagery, exaggeration, and moral judgment. Cleopatra becomes exotic, seductive, dangerous, a queen whose power was unnatural. This literary punishment substitutes for physical display. Since Rome couldn't show her in chains, it bound her reputation instead. Another mainstream fact weaves in. Augustus, formerly Octavian, celebrated a triple triumph that included Egypt as a conquered land, even without Cleopatra present. Statues and paintings stood in for the missing body. Rome is remarkably comfortable with substitutes. The message still landed. Egypt was subdued, its queen removed. There's a second quirky detail that lingers. Some Romans reportedly displayed images of Cleopatra in defeat, possibly depicting her death, as part of triumphal art. If true, it suggests Rome found a way to stage her humiliation posthumously. Even in absence, she was made to perform. Second gentle joke drifts by. Ancient Rome, proving once again that if you skip the parade, they'll just invent one for you. You sense a shift in Roman policy after Cleopatra. The danger of a living, charismatic queen becomes clearer. Parading such a figure risks sympathy, fascination, even admiration. Cleopatra's intelligence and presence might have captivated a Roman crowd in ways that undermined the message. Rome learned that some enemies are more useful as stories than as spectacles. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra's death influenced later treatment of captured queens. Did Rome become more cautious, more theatrical, or simply more ruthless behind closed doors? The evidence is suggestive but incomplete. Patterns emerge, but Rome rarely admits to learning lessons. You pass by a temple where Egyptian motifs have been repurposed as trophies. Obelisks stand in Roman plazas, stripped of context, admired for their shape rather than their meaning. This is punishment by appropriation. Cleopatra's world is not erased, it is rearranged to flatter Rome. Your third light joke arrives softly. Nothing says, "we beat you," like redecorating with your stuff. As you linger with Cleopatra's shadow, you realize her story complicates Rome's narrative. She was never seen kneeling, she was never led through the streets, and because of that, she remains vivid. Rome wanted closure, and instead it got a legend that refuses to stay quiet.
You feel the tension between relief and resentment in Roman memory. Relief that she did not stand as a living reminder of Rome's internal conflicts. Resentment that she escaped the ultimate humiliation Rome reserved for its greatest enemies. In avoiding the parade, Cleopatra shaped how future queens would be treated, watched more closely, guarded more carefully, punished with fewer opportunities for escape. As the night deepens, you let the image soften. Cleopatra reclines not in luxury now, but in history, half controlled, half wild. Rome never quite got what it wanted from her, and that may be why she lingers so strongly. You breathe slowly, letting her absence echo. The lesson Rome took forward is clear. Some queens must be shown, others must be silenced, but none can be allowed to choose the ending too freely. You feel the air change as the story shifts north and west, away from marble and incense toward rain-dark fields and wooden settlements. This is where Boudica waits in Roman memory, not as a captured queen, but as a warning etched into policy. You can sense Rome stiffen when her name is mentioned, even years later. She represents what happens when punishment fails to arrive in time. One mainstream historical fact anchors you here. Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe in Britain, led a massive revolt against Roman rule around AD 60-61. Roman sources describe entire cities burned and legions overwhelmed before Rome finally crushed the uprising. Unlike other queens, Boudica was never captured. According to Tacitus, she died, likely by poison, before Roman hands could reach her. And that absence mattered. You walk through the aftermath Rome remembers best. The rebellion shocked the empire because it exposed vulnerability. A woman, dismissed as peripheral by Roman gender norms, had mobilized tribes and humiliated Roman authority. This wasn't just a military embarrassment, it was ideological. Rome had failed to punish a queen publicly, and the cost was chaos. Here's a quirky tidbit that often surprises listeners easing towards sleep. Roman accounts linger obsessively on Boudica's appearance, her height, her hair, her voice. This fixation isn't admiration, it's anxiety. By emphasizing her otherness, Roman writers tried to contain the threat she represented, describe her as wild enough, and her success feels like an anomaly instead of a flaw in Roman rule. You notice how punishment shifts here from spectacle to prevention. After Boudica, Rome becomes far less tolerant of ambiguous royal arrangements in frontier regions. Client kings and queens are monitored more closely. Inheritance disputes are handled with heavier hands. Rome learns that leaving local rulers too much autonomy can backfire spectacularly. Historians still argue whether Roman mistreatment of Boudica's family directly caused the revolt or merely accelerated tensions already boiling. Some sources claim Roman officials flogged her and assaulted her daughters. Others caution that these details may be rhetorical devices meant to justify Roman retaliation. Standing here, you sense how Rome uses outrage selectively, condemning abuse only after it threatens stability. First light joke, drifting softly. Rome loved lessons, but it really hated learning them the hard way. You feel the weight of Roman paranoia settle in. Queens are no longer just defeated enemies, they are potential sparks. If captured, they must be neutralized completely. If not captured, their memory must be framed carefully. Boudica becomes a cautionary tale told to governors and generals. Do not underestimate. Do not delay. Do not allow symbols of resistance to linger. Another mainstream fact fits quietly into place. After the rebellion ends, Boudica's ghost influenced policy long after her body was gone.
There is another quirky detail that hums beneath the surface. Roman coins minted after the revolt emphasize stability, peace, and restored order. Imagery becomes softer, almost soothing. It's propaganda as comfort blanket, reminding citizens that chaos has been handled. Rome punishes not just rebels, but fear itself. Second gentle joke slips in. When your empire almost collapses, sometimes the best response is a very calming marketing campaign. You realize that Boudica's absence from a triumph may have made her more powerful in memory. Without chains, she remains upright in the imagination. Rome compensates by exaggerating her defeat, describing her end as inevitable and total. The narrative insists Rome always wins, even when the process was messy and frightening. Historians still argue whether Rome consciously adjusted how it treated captured queens because of Boudica. Did officials become harsher to prevent rebellion, or more strategic to avoid creating martyrs? The answer seems to be both. Rome oscillates between cruelty and calculation, depending on which feels safer at the time.
You picture governors discussing policy in low voices, Boudica's name unspoken but present. Allow a queen too much dignity, and she might inspire loyalty. Strip her too quickly, and she might ignite resistance. Punishment becomes a balancing act, refined through failure. Your third light joke arrives gently. Rome may have built roads everywhere, but it still managed to trip over the same political mistakes repeatedly. As you linger in this colder landscape, you sense how deeply Boudica reshaped Roman thinking. She taught them that punishment delayed is punishment denied, that queens, especially, must be handled decisively, either absorbed into Roman narratives or erased before they can speak on future queens with quieter hands and sharper intent. You breathe evenly, aware that the next story will show how Rome applied what it learned when a queen finally did survive capture. You drift back toward warmer air and longer shadows, where the story tightens instead of exploding. This is where Zenobia enters, not with fire and collapse like Boudica, but with patience, ambition, and a kind of quiet confidence that unnerves Rome just as much. You feel the empire recalibrating again, this time choosing restraint over rage. Zenobia is captured alive, and Rome must decide what kind of lesson she should become. One mainstream historical fact anchors your steps. Zenobia, Queen of Palmyra, challenged Roman authority in the 3rd century and briefly ruled over large parts of the Eastern Empire. When Emperor Aurelian defeated her around AD 272, she was taken prisoner and brought west. Unlike many before her, Zenobia survived. That survival is the mystery you're walking into. You imagine the moment of capture not as chaos, but as negotiation collapsing into inevitability. Zenobia had styled herself as a protector of Roman order, not a destroyer of it. That ambiguity matters. Rome prefers enemies who fit neatly into categories, and Zenobia refuses to cooperate. She is educated, multilingual, and reportedly fond of philosophy. Reducing her to a simple villain would require effort. Here's a quirky tidbit that hums softly. Later writers claim Zenobia traced her lineage to Cleopatra. Whether true or not, the comparison stuck. Rome couldn't ignore the echo. Cleopatra had slipped through their fingers. Zenobia was now firmly in their grasp. The temptation to make an example of her must have been strong. Historians still argue about Zenobia's treatment after capture. Some sources claim she was paraded in Aurelian's triumph in golden chains. Others insist she was spared public humiliation and lived out her life in relative comfort near Rome. The contradiction itself is revealing. Rome couldn't decide which story served it best. You sense Aurelian's dilemma. Executing Zenobia risks martyrdom. Humiliating her publicly risks admiration. Sparing her risks looking weak. Every option has consequences. This is punishment as public relations, and Rome is keenly aware of the audience. First light joke, easing in. Being a captured queen in Rome was like starring in a focus group, where every outcome tested badly. Another mainstream fact settles into place. Aurelian was known for restoring order during a chaotic period. His legitimacy depended on appearing both strong and just. Zenobia's fate became a tool for shaping his image. If he showed mercy, he looked magnanimous. If he punished her harshly, he looked decisive. Either way, Zenobia's body became a message. You walk through the imagined triumph, uncertain whether Zenobia is there or not. If she is, she moves with composure, chains gleaming but posture intact. If she isn't, her absence speaks volumes. Rome may have learned from Cleopatra that not every queen should be displayed. Sometimes sparing is more effective than shaming. There's another quirky detail that drifts by. Some accounts suggest Zenobia debated philosophers in her later life. The image is almost surreal. A former rebel queen discussing ideas under Roman patronage. Whether true or romanticized, it shows how Rome could absorb enemies instead of destroying them outright. Second gentle joke slides in. Rome's idea of rehabilitation apparently included house arrest and book clubs. Historians still argue whether Zenobia's survival was exceptional or simply convenient. Was she spared because she was admired, or because killing her no longer served Rome's interests? The answer likely lies in timing. The 3rd century was unstable, and Rome needed symbols of restored calm more than spectacles of blood. You feel the tone shift from fear to control. Zenobia is no longer dangerous once she is contained within Rome's structures. Her punishment is transformation. She goes from ruler to subject, from threat to ornament. This is Rome at its most confident, able to neutralize without annihilating. Your third light joke drifts softly. When Rome really won, it didn't need to shout about it. As the scene fades, you realize Zenobia represents a turning point. Rome has learned to vary its punishments, to tailor endings. Queens can be broken, erased, or repurposed. Survival does not mean victory. It means becoming part of someone else's story. You breathe slowly, letting the ambiguity settle. Zenobia's fate remains debated because Rome itself was undecided. And in that indecision, you glimpse an empire adapting, learning how to punish with subtlety instead of spectacle alone. You settle into the stone seats now, worn smooth by generations of bodies. And for the first time, you are not walking beside the punished. You are among the watchers. This is where Rome's system truly completes itself. Punishment is no longer private or even official. It becomes entertainment. You feel the shift immediately. Voices rise, laughter slips through, and the weight of earlier solemnity thins into something lighter, almost festive. Rome wants you comfortable while it teaches you a lesson. One mainstream historical fact grounds this scene. Public spectacle was central to Roman civic life. Triumphs, games, executions, and displays of captives were not fringe events. They were communal experiences that reinforced social order. Seeing defeated enemies reminded citizens of Rome's strength and their own safety within it. When a queen appeared, even briefly, she was folded into this shared performance. You notice how quickly gossip replaces analysis. People speculate about where she came from, what she did wrong, whether she looks proud or frightened. Accuracy doesn't matter much. What matters is participation. Everyone has an opinion, and having one means you're part of Rome, not its victim. Punishment works best when the audience feels included. Here's a quirky tidbit that often surprises people nodding off to Roman history. Spectators sometimes brought snacks to long public events. Nuts, bread, dried fruit, small comforts to accompany very large moral lessons. You imagine someone chewing thoughtfully while watching the aftermath of a fallen kingdom, and the contrast feels almost unreal. You sense how distance protects the crowd. From far enough away, chains look like accessories. Silence looks like composure. Rome counts on this. The further removed you are from suffering, the easier it is to interpret it as deserved. The queen becomes an abstract idea, defeat, rather than a person. Historians still argue whether Roman spectators felt genuine cruelty or simple curiosity.
Some accounts describe mockery and laughter. Others suggest moments of pity or discomfort. Sitting here, you suspect reactions varied wildly. Rome didn't need unanimous cruelty. It only needed normalization. If enough people treat punishment as ordinary, resistance fades. First light joke, drifting through the stands. Nothing brings a community together like collectively judging someone you've never met.
The spectacle doesn't always involve direct visibility. Sometimes the queen is glimpsed briefly, sometimes described by officials, sometimes represented symbolically. Absence can be as effective as presence. If people believe they've seen Rome's power, that belief becomes reality. The show works even when the curtain barely lifts. Another mainstream fact slides quietly into place. Roman elites understood crowd psychology well. Events were structured to build anticipation, deliver a controlled emotional peak, and then disperse the audience before chaos could form. Punishment was timed, framed, and concluded with care. Rome was less interested in outrage than in reassurance.
There's another quirky detail that hums beneath the noise. Some spectators collected souvenirs from public events, tokens, bits of decoration, even sketches. Imagine a child later pointing to a scratched carving and saying, "That's the day Rome showed a queen." Memory becomes portable. Second gentle joke slips in. Ancient Rome didn't have social media, but it definitely had people who wouldn't stop talking about what they saw.
You watch how officials manage the crowd's attention. When interest wanes, something new is introduced. Music, announcements, movement. The queen's role is finite. She is not meant to linger long enough to invite empathy. Rome understands that prolonged exposure can humanize, and humanizing undermines authority. Historians still argue whether public spectacle desensitized Roman citizens over time or sharpened their sense of belonging. Did watching punishment make people crueler or simply more invested in stability? The evidence points both ways. Rome's success suggests the system worked, but at a cost that's harder to measure.
You notice how quickly the crowd moves on once the moment passes. Conversations shift, children fidget, vendors shout again. The queen recedes into memory almost instantly. This too is punishment, to be briefly central, then forgotten, reduced to a story retold inaccurately over dinner. Your third light joke arrives softly. Rome was excellent at reminding you who mattered, and even better at reminding you how temporary that status could be. As the seats empty, you feel the echo of voices fade. The spectacle has done its job. The audience leaves reassured, entertained, and subtly aligned with power. No one is required to approve of cruelty. They only need to accept it as normal.
You stand slowly, stretching stiff legs, aware that the queen's punishment continues, even when unseen. Public spectacle is just one layer. Beneath it lies bureaucracy, memory, and narrative, all quieter, all longer lasting. You breathe evenly as you step away, knowing that Rome's greatest trick was not the chains or the parades, but convincing ordinary people that watching was enough.
You move away from the noise again, slipping through corridors where voices lower and footsteps soften. This is the part of Rome most people never see, where punishment wears a toga and speaks in careful phrases. The spectacle is over, but the process continues. Here, in shaded chambers and echoing halls, Rome pretends to weigh justice.
One mainstream historical fact anchors this quieter scene. High-status captives were sometimes subjected to formal hearings or interrogations, especially if their fate carried political consequences. These were not trials in the modern sense. Outcomes were often predetermined. Still, the ritual mattered. Rome valued the appearance of legality, even when the conclusion was already written. You imagine the queen standing before officials who avoid meeting her eyes. Questions are asked through translators. Answers are noted selectively. The language is dense, technical, and intentionally exhausting. Legal theater, like all good theater, relies on pacing. The slower the process, the more inevitable the ending feels.
Here's a quirky tidbit that often goes unnoticed. Roman law was famously flexible when dealing with foreigners. Concepts like citizenship, rights, and protections shifted depending on who you were and what Rome needed from you. For a queen, this meant existing in a gray zone, important enough to be discussed, but not important enough to be protected. You sense how delay becomes its own form of punishment. Days stretch into weeks, decisions are postponed. The queen is neither condemned nor freed. This limbo erodes certainty. Rome understands that waiting drains resistance more efficiently than force. When nothing happens, hope becomes harder to maintain. Historians still argue whether these proceedings ever genuinely influenced outcomes or simply documented them. Some records suggest captives were allowed to defend themselves. Others imply speeches were ignored. Standing here, you feel the weight of procedure designed to legitimize power rather than challenge it. First light joke, murmuring through the chamber. Imagine losing your kingdom and then being buried under paperwork. Another mainstream fact settles gently into place. Roman officials often framed punishment as restoration of order rather than retribution. Language mattered. Words like peace, stability, and security appeared frequently. By redefining punishment as maintenance, Rome avoided admitting cruelty. You notice how blame is distributed carefully. The queen is accused not of ambition, but of disruption. She disturbed the balance. She forced Rome's hand. This framing absolves the empire. Rome does not punish because it wants to. It punishes because it must. Responsibility shifts subtly but completely. There's another quirky detail that drifts in. Roman senators sometimes debated the fate of captives as a way to display their own virtue. Arguing for mercy made one look wise. Arguing for severity made one look strong. The queen's life becomes a stage for Roman self-image. Second gentle joke slides in. Nothing says justice like turning someone else's fate into your personal branding opportunity. Historians still argue whether gender affected these legal performances. Did queens receive more leniency because executing women felt uncomfortable, or harsher treatments because female authority felt threatening? The sources are inconsistent, which suggests Rome itself was inconsistent. Law bent around anxiety as much as principle. You watch how records are kept. Names are written, then abbreviated. Titles disappear. What remains is a reference number, a case file. Memory begins to thin. Once archived, the queen's story belongs to Rome. Future readers will encounter her filtered through ink and intention. Your third light joke drifts softly. Congratulations, you've been reduced to a footnote. Literally. As the hearings conclude, nothing dramatic happens. No gavel falls, no declaration echoes. The decision arrives quietly, delivered by a messenger or implied through action. This understated ending reinforces Rome's authority. Power that doesn't need to announce itself feels permanent. You step back, letting the cool air settle. Legal theater has done its work. The queen's fate is now framed as lawful, inevitable, and reasonable. Rome can move forward with a clear conscience, or at least a carefully constructed one. You breathe slowly, aware that the most enduring punishments often happen far from crowds, in rooms where language smooths away responsibility and silence finishes the job. You drift through Rome's quieter quarters, away from the parade and the halls of interrogation, into a world of private gardens, marble fountains, and shaded walkways where whispers carry further than shouts. This is the phase of punishment that rarely reaches the histories you read in textbooks, the slow, patient work of containment. The queen has survived the spectacle, endured bureaucratic rituals, and now she enters the domestic machinery of Rome. Her body is present, but her authority is gone, and every small interaction reminds her of it. One mainstream historical fact anchors the scene. High-status captives were often assigned residences in Rome, sometimes lavish, sometimes modest, depending on political expedience. These houses were more prisons than homes, carefully chosen to isolate, monitor, and reshape the captive. They were secure, yet comfortable enough to prevent martyrdom or illness, a delicate balance of threat and reassurance. You sense the calculated restraint in every choice of room, every guard stationed behind a column, every curtain left half drawn.
You notice how daily life becomes a form of punishment. Meals are offered at set times and attendance is expected. Conversations are permitted only when carefully orchestrated. Visitors are limited, screened for loyalty to Rome. The queen moves through her day under surveillance, and the simplicity of this control is its cruelty. Freedom of movement is replaced by predictability. Even silence has weight. It is a soundless chain, more effective than iron.
Here's a quirky tidbit that softens the edges. Some sources claim Roman captives were allowed to cultivate small gardens, not as reward, but as controlled occupation. A queen could tend plants, arrange flowers, perhaps even walk paths that echoed the palaces of her youth. But every step reminded her she was no longer in charge. Gardening becomes a metaphor for constrained power. Historians still argue whether this stage was designed for rehabilitation, humiliation, or mere practical control. Some accounts imply captives were treated politely to encourage assimilation into Roman culture. Others suggest psychological pressure was intentional, fostering dependency and eroding confidence. You feel both forces at work, like gentle tides reshaping a coastline over decades. First light joke drifts quietly. Imagine being the ruler of empires, now reduced to attending a lecture on proper etiquette and Roman household customs.
You notice the subtle language of dominance. The queen is addressed formally, yet her titles are softened or absent. Madam replaces queen, or sometimes just her name, in a tone designed to normalize her status as an ordinary guest. Even her guards mirror this restraint. They speak politely, but monitor incessantly. Every action, no matter how minor, becomes a lesson in containment. Another mainstream fact: the transition from public spectacle to private oversight could take months or years. Rome valued stability over speed. Punishment that burned too brightly risked sympathy, rebellion, or political complications. The longer a queen remained in this controlled environment, the more thoroughly her power eroded, without a single public display needed. There's another quirky detail to consider. Some captives were permitted to engage with scholars, philosophers, or artists. These interactions were ostensibly generous, yet they served as a subtle method of surveillance. Rome allowed knowledge to flow, but only within walls of confinement. Education became a soft chain. Second gentle joke slips in. Welcome to Rome's version of study abroad, where the curriculum is obedience and the campus never lets you leave. You begin to see how psychological manipulation complements physical containment. The queen is reminded of her loss through schedules, through careful omission of her former honors, through small but consistent signals of limitation. Absence of choice becomes pervasive. Even minor requests, asking to see certain rooms or to communicate with family, are filtered, approved, or ignored. Each tiny boundary reinforces the larger truth: she is no longer sovereign. Historians still argue about the morality of such containment. Was it humane, pragmatic, or cruelly efficient? Contemporary sources vary, colored by the perspectives of Roman writers, often male, often elite, often invested in presenting Rome as balanced and rational. You can almost hear their pens scratching notes about mercy while leaving the captive in psychological tension. You feel how endurance becomes part of punishment. Unlike brief spectacles or hearings, daily life in enforced residence requires sustained patience, mental vigilance, and subtle negotiation. Every day is predictable, yet every day carries the implicit reminder of lost power. This long, quiet pressure is invisible to the world, but it works steadily, like water wearing down stone. Your third light joke drifts gently. The empire may have conquered continents, but it perfected the art of scheduling boredom for maximum effect. As the evening descends, the gardens glow in soft light, shadows stretching like reminders of chains.
The queen walks paths that feel familiar, yet alien. Rome's careful orchestration continues without fanfare, without applause, and without visible cruelty. Here, in the silence of controlled routine, punishment is total and unrelenting. It is subtle, precise, and, in its way, inexorable. You breathe evenly, aware that this stage of containment may outlast triumphs, speeches, and public parades. Power has been removed quietly, invisibly, and the queen must learn to inhabit her own diminished presence.
You wander through Rome's quieter streets once again, where marble and brick create long shadows under lantern light. This stage of punishment is subtler still. The queen is no longer merely contained or observed. She is subtly reshaped. Rome now uses one of its oldest tools, culture. Not laws, not spectacle, but the quiet, persistent drip of influence that teaches a captive to see herself as Rome sees her. You feel it almost as a breeze, gentle but insistent, reshaping everything it touches.
One mainstream historical fact anchors this phase. High-status female captives were sometimes integrated into Roman households as symbols of submission and sophistication. They were expected to attend banquets, participate in social events, and even adopt Roman dress and customs. The goal was not only containment, but transformation, teaching a queen how to inhabit a world where her power no longer exists. You imagine the subtle discomfort. Every polite gesture is a reminder of limits. Every conversation, a measure of authority lost.
You notice how rituals of hospitality double as tools of control. A meal is not merely food, it is observation. Seating arrangements, portion sizes, even which servants attend, are carefully calibrated. Conversation is polite, but limited, offering the queen only as much autonomy as Rome allows. She participates, but always under subtle supervision. Every compliment or question carries the weight of implicit judgment, shaping behavior slowly over time.
Here's a quirky tidbit that drifts almost imperceptibly. Some captives were encouraged to study Latin literature or Greek philosophy, not as enrichment, but as a method of familiarizing them with Rome's moral and cultural values. Reciting verses aloud could serve as both education and surveillance, allowing officials to gauge comprehension, temperament, and compliance. You imagine the soft cadence of a queen reciting lines she once never needed to learn.
Historians still argue whether this cultural assimilation was genuinely benevolent or a refined method of psychological control. Some sources imply captives gained education and refinement. Others suggest the ultimate aim was to strip identity slowly, molding obedience while preserving health and appearance. You sense that both interpretations exist simultaneously, each supported by selective anecdotes. First light joke drifts through the room. Being forced to read Homer while your empire lies in ruins is probably the most cultured punishment imaginable. You observe how attire plays a continuous role. The queen may retain certain luxurious fabrics, yet always in styles chosen to remind her of her new status. Jewelry is subtle, colors muted. Even hairstyles are suggested by Roman etiquette rather than personal preference. Fashion becomes a slow, visible form of behavioral control, reinforcing her diminished place in the social hierarchy.
Another mainstream fact: integration often included limited freedom to attend temples, festivals, and theaters, always accompanied. Participation allows for exposure to Roman norms and simultaneous observation. Religion, theater, and social engagement are subtly weaponized, methods of accustoming the captive to Roman dominance without overt violence.
There's another quirky detail. Roman household manuals recommend assigning pets or ornamental animals to noble captives, ostensibly for comfort. In practice, caring for them becomes a daily responsibility that subtly reinforces dependency, structure, and obedience. You imagine the queen brushing a small dog's coat, the mundane act a reminder of everything she no longer commands. Second gentle joke slides softly.
from ruling nations to walking dogs. Some promotions really are lateral moves.
You sense the cumulative effect of time. Days blend into weeks, weeks into months. The queen's former identity, once anchored in armies, decisions, and loyal followers, now drifts, gently buffeted by expectation and routine. Rome understands that power can be eroded silently and persistently, like water shaping stone over decades.
Historians still argue how willingly captives complied with cultural assimilation. Some appear to have resisted subtly, through gestures, words, or delays. Others adopted Roman norms with surprising ease, either out of survival instinct or genuine interest. You feel the subtle tension between outward conformity and inward memory, a tension Rome carefully monitors but cannot fully extinguish. Your third light joke drifts through, nearly imperceptible. Apparently, nothing tames ambition quite like etiquette lessons. By the time months pass, even the queen's private reflections carry Roman traces. The structure of daily life, the constant observation, and the expectation to participate in controlled activities gradually reshape thought patterns. Obedience is no longer forced, it becomes habitual. The punishment is quiet, psychological, and extraordinarily enduring. You breathe slowly, noticing how effectively power has been redefined. The queen remains alive, dignified in appearance, even courteous. Yet every day reinforces her new place in the world. She has survived spectacle, interrogation, and containment, only to find that culture itself is a chain she cannot easily remove.
The evening deepens, and with it, the subtle victories of Rome accumulate. Punishment is complete not with dramatic acts, but through enduring, silent adaptation. You feel the weight of that quiet work, and the hum of inevitability settles gently around you. You wander through a quieter wing of Rome, where sunlight filters through latticed windows and the air carries the scent of olive oil and incense. Here, the punishment shifts again, moving from culture to subtle social isolation. The queen, now contained and partially assimilated, experiences the slow erosion of influence among those around her. Her presence is tolerated, her knowledge respected, but her voice is carefully moderated. Every smile and gesture is scrutinized. Every conversation is a measure of compliance. You feel how effective control becomes when it is invisible. One mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Roman practice often involved separating high-status captives from their former supporters. In some cases, attendants, companions, or family members were removed to prevent plotting, escape, or influence. By cutting these connections, Rome ensured the captive could not rely on familiar support systems, weakening both morale and authority. You imagine the quiet tension in empty rooms, where voices once guided policy and counsel, now replaced by polite attendants who offer nothing beyond observation. You notice how small routines become instruments of control. Meals are timed, seating arranged, and opportunities for informal gathering are limited. Even casual requests are answered with measured delays. Social contact becomes a tool for shaping perception, rewarding compliance, discouraging dissent, and subtly reinforcing subordination. The queen moves through each day, aware that her influence is curtailed, even in trivial interactions.
Here's a quirky tidbit that drifts softly. Some Roman captives were assigned companions specifically to monitor them, disguised as friends or equals. These informal spies observe demeanor, record behavior, and report back. You imagine whispering attendants at garden walls, taking mental notes on posture, eye contact, and tone, like librarians cataloging a human manuscript. Historians still argue whether these methods were psychologically coercive or simply precautionary. Some suggest Rome deliberately created emotional pressure. Others argue that social isolation was a practical necessity to prevent uprisings. You feel the dual nature of the tactic. It is both efficient and quietly cruel.
shaping thought without the overt use of force. First light joke drifts through. The longest chains are often invisible, tied around conversation and companionship. You notice the way visitors are carefully curated. Senators, envoys, and minor nobles may be allowed to see the queen, but interactions are scripted. Questions are allowed, but topics are guided. Praise is measured, and disagreement is politely curtailed. The queen is a participant in society, yet simultaneously a lesson for it. Her life becomes a performance, even in private spaces.
Another mainstream fact slides gently into place. Psychological isolation has long been recognized, even in ancient times, as a tool of subjugation. Romans understood the power of monotony, expectation, and subtle control over long-term outcomes. A captive's survival was often easier to ensure through constant, low-level constraint than through dramatic execution. The slow drip of limitation can wear down resistance more reliably than chains or imprisonment.
There's another quirky detail to linger on. Some sources suggest Roman captives were encouraged to engage in minor governance-like tasks within the household, such as organizing banquets or overseeing servants. This created the illusion of authority while keeping real power out of reach. You imagine a queen instructing staff in matters that once required armies and policy, her decisions small, contained, and inconsequential. Second gentle joke slides softly. From ruling kingdoms to assigning napkins, some promotions are purely symbolic.
You feel how time shapes perception. Days bleed into weeks, weeks into months. Without her former allies, the queen learns to navigate Rome's carefully measured environment. Even her subversive ideas are filtered through layers of observation and controlled response. Rome has transformed her into a figure whose presence is powerful in memory, but muted in practice.
Historians still argue how captives responded to these social manipulations. Some appear to have resisted through subtle gestures, quiet refusals, sense the delicate balance between compliance and quiet autonomy, one carefully maintained by both sides. Your third light joke drifts almost imperceptibly. Nothing says power shift like watching your former court reduced to polite silence. As the sun dips, casting long shadows across the gardens and corridors, the queen's isolation becomes evident not through dramatic cruelty, but through subtle separation. She is surrounded by attendants, yet separated from influence. She converses, yet her voice carries less weight. Rome's punishment is complete, not with spectacle, but with absence. Absence of power, presence of control. You breathe slowly, sensing how enduring this method is. Unlike triumphs, parades, or public spectacles, social isolation works quietly, persistently, and invisibly. It shapes thought, restricts influence, and conditions behavior without a single shout or chain. The queen may appear dignified, even content, but you know that every interaction has been measured, every relationship carefully managed, and every day structured to remind her who now controls the narrative. The evening deepens, shadows long and calm. You feel the full weight of Rome's subtle architecture of punishment, spectacle, legal ritual, cultural shaping, and now social isolation, each layer reinforcing the last. The queen remains, intact in form, diminished in influence. And you realize that Rome's genius lies not just in conquest, but in the patient, unhurried reshaping of the very air around her. You follow the faint echoes of marble halls into the softer corridors, where Rome applies its most subtle punishment, enforced dependency. By now, the queen has survived the spectacle, endured the hearings, and navigated the quiet social isolation. Yet her autonomy continues to erode imperceptibly as she becomes reliant on the very system that defeated her. Every meal, every message, every interaction is mediated. You feel the quiet gravity of power shifting, as if the air itself reminds her of limits she cannot escape.
One mainstream historical fact anchors this stage. Captured queens were often provided with attendants, supplies, and amenities, but these came with strings attached. Permission had to be granted for travel, for communication with family, and even for leisure activities. Dependency was built in layers, creating a captive who survived comfortably, but only within the boundaries set by Rome. You imagine the subtle anxiety in knowing that every necessity, from food to books to company, is conditional.
You notice how routines reinforce control. The queen may have a garden, yet she is not free to wander beyond it. She may have meals, yet their timing and content are dictated. She may speak, yet only to those approved. This is punishment without force, a quiet structure that conditions behavior gradually. Every small favor granted reminds her that survival depends on conformity. Rome has transformed autonomy into privilege.
Here's a quirky tidbit to lighten the weight. Some queens were allowed pets, not as indulgence, but as structured occupation. Caring for animals provides purpose while reinforcing dependence. You imagine the queen brushing a small dog or adjusting a cage, an almost domestic task loaded with symbolic meaning. She nurtures life without controlling power. Even her compassion is shaped.
Historians still argue whether enforced dependency was psychologically destructive or merely a practical necessity. Some scholars emphasize the stress and erosion of independence, while others suggest it provided stability and security in uncertain political climates. You sense both dynamics coexisting, reinforcing each other with quiet effectiveness. Dependency is both soft and unyielding. First light joke drifts quietly. Surviving a kingdom's collapse is easy if you just learn to beg politely for cheese.
You notice how relationships with attendants and overseers shift subtly. A guard's polite suggestion, a servant's measured smile, becomes a gentle reminder that even small choices are guided by Rome. Power no longer resides in the queen. It is delegated and monitored. She negotiates influence through minor gestures, careful wording, and strategic compliance. Every interaction is a negotiation with invisible authority.
Another mainstream fact: some captives were allowed correspondence with distant relatives or allies, but these communications were often censored or delayed. Rome controlled the flow of information, ensuring that dependency extended even to emotional and familial ties. The queen may feel connected, yet every connection is mediated. Freedom is present only in fragments.
There's another quirky detail. Certain queens were encouraged to participate in domestic crafts or intellectual pursuits, ostensibly as education, sometimes as entertainment for Roman households. In practice, these activities reinforced subtle hierarchy. Even skillful or creative work could not elevate the queen beyond her confined role. You imagine delicate embroidery or reading Greek philosophy, tasks infused with both dignity and quiet control. Second gentle joke drifts in. From ruling armies to arranging flower petals, Rome has a way of making even genius look like chore.
You feel the passage of time become part of the punishment. Dependency stretches over months and years, embedding itself in habit. The queen learns to anticipate conditions, adapt, and comply. The absence of choice becomes so normalized that it feels almost like comfort. Yet beneath the surface, the reminder of vulnerability persists. Power is not lost in a single moment. It is drained quietly, day by day.
Historians still argue how willingly captives adapted to dependency. Some resisted subtly, asserting independence in minor ways. Others accepted it as survival strategy. You sense that Rome designed the system to accommodate both reactions, ensuring that even resistance reinforces observation and containment. Dependency becomes a mirror, reflecting the queen's adaptation back to her as evidence of control. Your third light joke drifts gently. Nothing tests patience like learning that your daily comfort depends entirely on someone else's approval.
As the day softens into evening, you feel the full weight of this stage. The queen moves with grace, speaks with poise, and maintains appearances. Yet beneath the veneer, every need, every comfort, every minor freedom is carefully curated by the empire. Dependency is invisible, polite, and relentless. It is a punishment measured in months and habits, unrecorded in triumphs, uncelebrated in writings, but effective beyond measure. You breathe slowly, aware that power can be removed as efficiently without chains or spectacle as with them. The queen's survival depends not on force, but on her adaptation to a system designed to keep her subtly, inexorably, in its grasp. You follow the quiet rhythm of the queen's days as they unfold under Roman supervision, and you begin to notice something remarkable. Punishment is no longer just about containment, spectacle, or dependency. Now it becomes legacy management. Rome understands that the memory of a captured queen can be as dangerous or as useful as her living presence. You feel the deliberate shaping of narrative, the subtle guidance of how she will be remembered, even by herself. Every gesture, every command, every allowed reflection is carefully curated to maintain imperial authority.
One mainstream historical fact anchors this phase. Romans often manipulated the post-capture image of queens for propaganda purposes. Coins, reliefs, inscriptions, and written accounts were adjusted to present captives as defeated, humiliated, or docile. Sometimes, even if the queen survived comfortably, the narrative emphasized her submission and Rome's triumph. Memory becomes a tool, as critical to punishment as chains or confinement. You imagine the queen observing these depictions, understanding that history itself is now another arena of control. You notice how her daily interactions feed into this process. Attendants are instructed to report not only actions, but demeanor, tone, and subtle expressions. The queen is made aware that appearances matter, that Rome is watching, and that perception carries more weight than reality. Every polite smile, every carefully measured word reinforces the empire's version of events. Punishment extends into self-perception, shaping behavior through anticipation and reflection. Here's a quirky tidbit that drifts gently. Some captives were given gifts or privileges specifically for performance in public or private spheres, encouraging them to conform to the narrative Rome desired. You imagine small luxuries, books, jewelry, elaborate meals, offered strategically, as much reward as gentle manipulation. Even generosity becomes a form of control, teaching compliance through choice and shaping memory through gratitude.
Historians still argue whether these manipulations of memory were effective in the long term. Some evidence suggests captives resisted subtly, telling their own stories in private, which could influence sympathetic outsiders. Other sources imply the queen internalized Rome's framing, adjusting her recollection of events to match the official narrative. You sense both outcomes exist simultaneously, an interplay between control and subtle resistance. First light joke drifts softly. It's hard to lose an empire when you're still getting your daily tea served on silver trays. You notice the careful cultivation of alliances too. Friends or former advisors may be invited to visit, but only under strict supervision. Their presence reinforces certain lessons while limiting potential influence. The queen's social network is transformed into a vehicle for storytelling, teaching her how to exist within Rome's approved framework. Every interaction carries both comfort and caution. Another mainstream fact: Roman historians often relied on such curated images of captives when writing accounts. Triumphs, speeches, and inscriptions shaped the story for posterity. The queen's real actions mattered less than how they were represented. In essence, punishment had extended beyond her lifetime into the historical record. Being alive is one layer, shaping memory is another. There's another quirky detail that whispers quietly.
Some captives were encouraged to maintain personal journals or correspondence that aligned with Roman expectations. These documents were sometimes monitored, selectively published, or used as propaganda. Even writing, normally a private act, became a form of controlled narrative. You imagine the queen carefully choosing words, knowing each letter could reinforce Rome's story. Second gentle joke slides in. Apparently, the pen was mightier than the sword, especially if Rome read over your shoulder. Historians still argue how much agency captives retained in shaping their own posthumous reputations. Some may have cleverly embedded subtle resistance, hidden truths, or coded pride. Others may have fully acquiesced, leaving future generations with a version of events that favored Rome. You feel that both scenarios illustrate the empire's careful manipulation of legacy as a final form of punishment.
You notice how subtly the queen's identity is reframed. Former titles and honors may be reduced in conversation, replaced with polite descriptors, or omitted entirely from official documents. Her persona becomes defined by Roman interpretation rather than her own achievements. The empire is teaching her to inhabit the narrative Rome has written. Even dignity is moderated, reshaped by constant observation. Your third light joke drifts softly. Losing your kingdom never felt so polished and carefully footnoted. As evening falls, you sense that this stage completes the arc of Roman punishment. The queen is alive, contained, observed, dependent, and subtly reshaped. Her behavior, her thoughts, her memory, and even her story have been incorporated into the empire's framework. Punishment is no longer purely physical or psychological. It has become historical, permanent, and pervasive. You breathe slowly, letting the weight of this understanding settle. Rome has mastered the art of comprehensive control. The queen's life and the story told about her serve as lessons in power, survival, and narrative dominance. Even in survival, punishment persists. Quiet, calculated, and enduring. You feel the inevitability of Rome's system, subtle, patient, and fully aware that control over perception is as important as control over action. You move toward the final stage, where the punishment is no longer immediate, no longer overt, but almost invisible, embedded in the passage of time itself. The queen has survived spectacle, hearings, social isolation, and enforced dependency. She has been culturally reshaped, in her memory carefully curated. Now, Rome relies on the slow, inevitable effect of endurance. Power erodes, not through chains or speeches, but through the subtle accumulation of years, habits, and quiet observation. You feel the weight of inevitability settling like dusk over the empire. One mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Some captured queens were allowed to live for decades under Roman supervision. Their survival itself became part of the empire's strategy, demonstrating Rome's dominance while minimizing the risk of martyrdom. Time became a tool, patience became a weapon, and endurance became punishment. You imagine a queen tracing the patterns of shadows across her garden walls, knowing that the years themselves are as controlling as chains once were. You notice how the passage of time interacts with memory. The queen's former identity, once so vivid and commanding, gradually fades in personal recollection and in the perception of others. Generals, advisors, and courtiers move on. Children grow, and the empire itself continues to expand. History begins to forget the immediacy of her power. You sense that survival has paradoxically become a measure of control. The longer she lives under Rome's rules, the more thoroughly her influence is diminished. Here's a quirky tidbit that floats quietly. Some queens reportedly maintained hobbies like music, embroidery, or small-scale tutoring of household members. These activities were framed as leisurely, even enjoyable, but in practice they reinforced routine and subordination. Even creative expression became a form of subtle conditioning. You imagine the soft scratch of a needle or the quiet strum of a lyre.
each note reinforcing patience, precision, and quiet obedience.
Historians still argue whether prolonged survival under Roman observation constituted cruelty or pragmatism. Some emphasize the psychological strain of years spent in measured restriction. Others argue that the queen's life was preserved and cushioned, suggesting a form of humane containment. You feel both interpretations coexisting. Survival is both a mercy and a calculated mechanism of slow punishment. First light joke drifts softly. Nothing says long-term planning like having your daily walks, meals, and music carefully scheduled for decades.
You notice how subtle routines reinforce control in this final stage. Meals, attire, interactions, and intellectual pursuits remain under Roman supervision. Even minor privileges are conditional, reminding the queen that her existence is sustained by empire's goodwill. Independence is a memory, comfort is granted, influence is carefully limited. She navigates the quiet architecture of power without ever fully regaining it.
Another mainstream fact settles gently into place. Some captives were permitted to correspond or interact with distant allies and family, but always under scrutiny. Letters were monitored, visits limited, and influence constrained. Connection became a tool for observation, a means to ensure compliance while reducing the likelihood of rebellion. The queen survives, yet she remains under the invisible hand of Rome.
There's another quirky detail. Some historical accounts suggest captives were allowed to oversee domestic animals or small gardens. Though seemingly mundane, these tasks provided focus while reinforcing dependency. The queen's responsibilities became symbolic microcosms of the authority she had once wielded broadly. You imagine her carefully tending plants or brushing animals, every act simultaneously empowering and diminishing her. Second gentle joke slides in. Who knew that empire-building skills would translate so perfectly into pruning hedges?
You sense the full effect of endurance. Years layer one upon another, smoothing away the edges of ambition. The queen's voice, once commanding armies and councils, now carries only within private spaces and controlled interactions. Rome's control extends temporally, beyond spectacle, beyond immediate observation, into the quiet erosion of autonomy over time. Her survival is both literal and symbolic, proof of Rome's power and subtle evidence of her diminished authority.
Historians still argue how effectively time alone serves as punishment. Some captives may have found ways to assert influence privately. Others may have resigned entirely, internalizing Rome's control. You feel that the uncertainty itself is part of the empire's strategy. By leaving room for speculation, Rome ensures the queen remains a lesson, not just for herself, but for anyone who observes her existence. Your third light joke drifts softly. Apparently, the ultimate Roman punishment is slow, polite, and almost entirely invisible.
As night settles, the queen's life softens into a rhythm of measured observation and quiet endurance. Rome's punishment is complete not with a single dramatic act, but with decades of controlled living, structured freedom, and subtle limitation. The empire's genius is in its patience. The longer the queen survives, the more effectively her authority diminishes. Her existence, framed and constrained, becomes the lasting reminder of Roman mastery.
You breathe slowly, letting the scene settle, and now the story begins to unwind. The garden paths, the measured meals, the carefully curated interactions all fade softly in your mind. The lessons of spectacle, hearings, social isolation, dependency, cultural assimilation, narrative shaping, and endurance blend into a final, gentle understanding. Punishment need not be violent to be total. Power can be removed quietly, over time, leaving dignity intact, while influence gradually fades.
Now dim the lights, adjust your position, and let your own body absorb the slow, rhythmic calm of centuries past. The empire has finished its work, and you can let the weight of history ease gently from your shoulders. Notice your breath, steady and soft, as shadows lengthen and the quiet hush of night envelops you. Every story has its conclusion, and this one leaves you with the sense of slow, deliberate closure, as gentle as the flicker of candlelight in a quiet Roman hall. The day has ended in a soft, deliberate rhythm. You feel the weight of centuries pressing lightly, not with urgency, but with the gentle insistence of memory. The queens of Rome, each in their own way, have walked through triumph and defeat, spectacle and scrutiny, isolation and endurance. Their stories are lessons etched quietly into the fabric of history, teaching power, patience, and the subtle art of control. Imagine the gardens, the soft rustle of leaves, the faint scent of olive oil and incense. These are spaces where authority lingers invisibly, shaping behavior without noise. You feel the slow, persistent passage of time, the kind that erodes fear as surely as it shapes thought. Survival becomes both mercy and measure. Daily routines, carefully orchestrated interactions, and minor privileges work together like gentle tides, reshaping identity and influence over years. The queens live, yes, but within parameters that teach them the empire's lessons, without dramatic chains, without public shaming. Even absence becomes a tool of control, shaping memory and perception in ways both subtle and enduring. The lessons of Rome are complete, and the night now surrounds you. You are neither captive nor spectator, only observer, carried by the rhythm of centuries past. As your body relaxes and your mind softens, remember the quiet power of time, routine, and observation. Allow your thoughts to drift, unbound yet comforted, as history eases into memory and the hush of evening fills the room. In this slow, measured calm, the world and its stories settle into place, and you too can surrender to rest. Sweet dreams.